He could have kept the job. All Holt Brennan had to do was sign one piece of paper, a safety clearance, for a production line he knew would kill someone. He refused. 11 days later, his best friend died on that line. 3 weeks after that, Holt walked out of Vance Industries with a cardboard box, no severance, and a phone call he hadn't expected. 3 orphaned little girls who had nowhere else to go. He took them home. He raised them alone. 20 years later, those 3 girls walked back into that building as the new owners. The kitchen in the rented house on Linden Street was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Holt Brennan sat at the table in the second week of November, 2004, counting the same stack of bills he had counted the night before, $1,847. That was every cent he had left in the world. Rent on the house was due in 11 days, and rent on the house was $420. The phone on the wall rang twice before he answered. A woman named Margaret Hensley from Hartwell County Family Services introduced herself in the careful voice people use when they are about to ask something difficult. She said his name had come up as an emergency contact in the file of Daniel Cole. She said Daniel's 3 daughters were in temporary placement at the county shelter, and she needed to know if he was in a position to talk. Holt closed his eyes. Daniel had been buried 8 days. His wife Anna had died of cancer 6 months before that. There were no grandparents. There was an aunt in Florida who had said no over the telephone without taking a full breath. Holt told Margaret he would be there in 40 minutes. The Ford Ranger started on the 3rd try. Hartwell in late November was a town of brown grass and tired storefronts, and the county building on Maple sat behind a parking lot full of cracked asphalt. Margaret Hensley was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair. She walked Holt down a hallway and stopped outside a door with a small rectangular window. "Mr. Brennan, I want to be honest with you. We have a family in Erie willing to take the youngest, a foster home in Williamsport for the middle child. The oldest will likely stay in the county system until she ages out. 3 different counties. They are unlikely to see each other again in any meaningful way." She opened the door. The 3 girls were on a vinyl couch under a fluorescent light. Maggie was 7 and sitting in the middle. Ruth was 5 on her left. Junie was 2 on her right, holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. Maggie had a hand on each of her sister's wrists, not tight, just resting there. She looked up when Holt walked in. She did not cry. She did not get up. She said, very quietly, "My daddy said you were the best person at the place where he worked." Holt did not answer for what felt like a long time. He signed the temporary guardianship papers at Margaret's desk. Margaret told him a judge would review the arrangement in 90 days, and that he would need to demonstrate stable income by then. She did not say what would happen if he could not. That night at 412 Linden Street, the 3 girls slept across one double bed, Junie in the middle, the stuffed rabbit between her chin and Maggie's shoulder. Holt sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list on the back of an envelope. Margie's Bakery, Henley's Garage, the dairy farm out on Route 6, the hardware store. He drew a line under it and wrote a second list of tools he already owned. In the morning, he set down 3 bowls of cereal and 1 cup of coffee. Junie did not yet know how to use a spoon. Maggie reached over without being asked and fed her. 20 years later, in Philadelphia, the conference room on the 38th floor of Vance Industries had glass walls on 3 sides and a view that took in the Schuylkill all the way down to the refineries. Eleanor Whitford had been working out of that room for 6 days. The acquisition was a clean one on paper. Cole Holdings, a Boston-based industrial investment group founded 8 years earlier by 3 sisters, was offering $340 million for a full buyout of Vance Industries. The safety equipment manufacturer Richard Vance had inherited from his father in 1986. Richard had hired Eleanor personally. She was 41, a partner at Whitford and Crane, and the firm's lead in midcap M&A. Richard wanted someone who would not embarrass him in the room, and he had paid the retainer in advance. The 3 Cole sisters came in at 9 o'clock sharp on a Tuesday morning. Margaret Cole, the chief executive, took the seat at the head of the table without asking. She was 27, dark blonde, wore a navy suit cut close, and ran the meeting like she had been running meetings for 10 years. Ruth, the chief financial officer, sat to her right with a leather portfolio and did not smile. Juniper, the youngest, did the introductions, soft-voiced, taking notes. Margaret laid out the timeline. 6 weeks to close, full operational handover, no carve-outs. She said the financing was already cleared with their bank in Boston. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that the final contract would need to include one non-financial clause that her team would send over within the week. Richard Vance, sitting at the opposite end, asked what kind of clause. Margaret said only, "You will see it when you see it." Eleanor walked back to her office at Whitford and Crane on Market Street and opened the Cole Holdings due diligence file. She read for 2 hours. Then she stopped. The three sisters had filed legal name changes at the age of 18, all three of them dropping a hyphen. Their birth certificates listed them as Margaret Cole Brennan, Ruth Cole Brennan, and Juniper Cole Brennan. The address of record for all three through high school was 412 Linden Street, Hartwell, Pennsylvania. The legal guardian on every document filed between the years 2004 and 2016 was a man named Holt Brennan. Eleanor opened the United States Patent and Trademark Office database in a new tab. She typed the name in. 14 patents came back, every one of them related to industrial safety systems, pressure valve redundancies, emergency shutoff protocols, conveyor line fail-safes. Every one of them had been assigned, on the date of filing, to Vance Industries. The earliest was from 2001. The most recent was dated November 4, 2004. After that date, nothing. The name Holt Brennan disappeared from every engineering database she could pull. She opened a browser and typed his name with the words Vance Industries and the year. The third result down was a short article from the Hartwell Register, archived behind a small local paper's paywall. The headline read, "Local engineer released following production line incident." The article was 11 paragraphs long. It did not name Daniel Cole. Eleanor printed it. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for what felt like a long time. She called her assistant and said to cancel her dinner. She said she was driving up to Hartwell in the morning. Her hand stayed on the keyboard. The cursor blinked in an empty search bar. Hartwell, Pennsylvania, on a Saturday morning in late October, was a town of one main street, 2 coffee shops, a white Methodist church with a steeple that needed paint, and a war memorial in a small triangle of grass at the intersection of Main and 2nd. Eleanor parked across from the church and pulled up the address on her phone. 412 Linden was a one-story wood house painted a faded slate blue, with a covered porch, a rocking chair, and a clay pot of begonias gone yellow with the season. The garage door was open. From inside came the steady noise of a machine being worked on. She walked up the gravel drive. A man in a gray work shirt was bent over an air compressor mounted on a wheeled cart. He was tall, lean, and had the kind of forearms that came from 40 years of using his hands. His hair was brown going gray at the temples. He looked up at the sound of her boots on the gravel. She introduced herself. She gave the firm's name. She said she was the counsel representing Vance Industries in the acquisition by Cole Holdings. Holt Brennan wiped his hands on a shop rag. He did not extend one to shake. He said, "I figured someone would come up here eventually." She asked if he knew his 3 daughters were preparing to buy the company that had fired him. He said, slowly, "I know they're doing something big. I haven't asked the details. I've never wanted them living their lives because of mine." Eleanor took in the garage as he spoke. The tools were arranged on pegboards with the precision of a laboratory. A drill press, a small lathe, a torque wrench rack, a row of calipers laid out by size. Above the workbench, taped to the bare wood, was a yellowed engineering drawing. She stepped closer. It was a schematic for a pressure relief assembly on something labeled Production Line 7, dated October 2004. Across the bottom, in red ink that had faded to brown, was a stamp, Rejected H. Brennan. He invited her into the kitchen for coffee. The kitchen was small and clean. A drip machine, a chipped white mug, a window over the sink that looked into the backyard. On a shelf in the next room, she could see a single framed photograph. Holt and 3 young women in cut-off shorts at a lake shore, the youngest holding up a small fish. No diplomas on the walls, no commendations, no corporate plaques, nothing to suggest that the man pouring her coffee had once held 14 patents. She asked him, while the coffee dripped, how long he had been doing repair work in town. He said he had started the week after he was let go. He said the first job had been a kerosene heater belonging to a woman 2 streets over who had paid him in casseroles for a month because she did not have the cash. He said it had been the easiest decision of his life to keep going. He answered her questions in short sentences. He did not know what was in the final clause. He did not know the deal size. He had not known her name an hour ago. When she asked if his daughters ever talked about the company, He said only that they had stopped asking about his work years ago, and he had taken that as a kindness rather than as distance. She watched him from across the table. He had the steady hands of a man who had not raised his voice in a long time, she thought, but did not say, that she had spent 15 years in conference rooms full of men who had built less and shouted more. She drove back down I-76 in silence for 2 hours. Somewhere outside Coatesville she said aloud to the empty car, "Who am I working for in this? And who am I working against?" She did not have an answer yet. By the time she reached the city, the sun was almost down, and the skyline of Philadelphia ahead of her looked, for the first time in a long career, like the wrong end of something. The 41st floor of the Cole Holdings building looked out over the Delaware. The afternoon light came through the window, low and gold, and lay across the carpet in a long stripe. Margaret Cole sat behind a wide walnut desk that had nothing on it but a laptop, a yellow legal pad, and one small framed photograph. Turned toward the window 3 young women in graduation gowns and a man in a gray sport coat, standing between them with his hands awkwardly at his sides. Eleanor had asked for the meeting alone. No assistants, no paralegals. Margaret had agreed without asking why. Eleanor sat down across from her and said, "The non-financial clause. I need to see it now." Margaret did not hesitate. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. 3 numbered items, typed, no letterhead. 1. Vance Industries shall issue a public statement, hosted on its corporate website and submitted as a press release of record, formally restoring the professional reputations of any employees wrongfully terminated within the preceding 25 years. 2. The name Holt Brennan shall be specifically included in that statement, with a sentence acknowledging his role in identifying the design defect on production line 7 prior to the incident of November 22, 2004. 3. A signed letter of apology, bearing the personal signature of Richard Vance, shall be delivered directly to Holt Brennan at his home address. A symbolic settlement of $1 shall accompany the letter. Eleanor read it twice. She put it down. Margaret had not taken her eyes off the window the entire time. "My father, my adoptive father, has never told us a word of it," she said. Her voice was quiet and level. "I started pulling records in law school. It took me 4 years. Ruth and Junie didn't know what I was doing until last year. He doesn't know what we are doing, and he isn't going to know until it is finished." Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. She was, at that exact second, the lead counsel for the other side. She was representing Richard Vance. If she walked this clause into the next negotiation session, Richard would withdraw from the deal within the hour and would have grounds, under the engagement letter she had signed in his office 6 weeks ago, to file a complaint with the bar against her personally for material breach. She rode the elevator down 41 floors without pressing any other button. Halfway down, she thought of a case from 8 years ago. A welder named David Klein at a steel fabricator in Reading had refused to sign a safety attestation on a faulty rig. The company fired him. He came to her firm. They took the case on partial contingency. They lost at trial because there were no internal witnesses willing to testify, and the documentation had been shredded. David Klein hanged himself in his garage 3 months after the verdict came down. Eleanor had been second chair. She had not gone to the funeral. She had told herself at the time that the family would not want her there, and she had believed it for about a week. She drove home to her apartment in Rittenhouse, poured a glass of wine she did not drink, and opened her laptop. She started pulling public records on Vance Industries between 2003 and 2005. OSHA reports, civil court filings, archived issues of the Hartwell Register. She wrote a single sentence at the top of a new document on her desktop, in 12-point type, and she did not name the document and she did not save it. "I do not want to be on the wrong side of this one." She did not sleep until 4 in the morning. The OSHA final report on the production line 7 incident was dated January 11, 2005. It ran 47 pages. Eleanor read it through twice, taking notes on a legal pad. The conclusion was clear and brief. Operator error on the part of decedent Daniel Cole, a senior line technician with 11 years at the facility. The internal signatory representing Vance was the vice president of legal at the time, a man named Garrett Vance, Richard's older brother, dead now of a heart attack in 2017. The Hartwell Register archive she had to drive up for in person at the public library on Main Street. The library had bound volumes going back to 1962. She found the December 4th issue of 2004 on the second shelf, page 7, section B. A small article, 3 columns wide. Under the headline, "Questions Linger on Vance Plant Incident." The reporter quoted an unnamed engineer at the facility who said the design of the line had a systemic flaw in the secondary pressure relief assembly. The reporter's name was Carla Mendez. Eleanor wrote it down in her notebook. She cross-referenced the personnel records that had been entered into the OSHA case as exhibits. The lead systems engineer assigned to production line 7 for the calendar year 2004 was Holt Brennan. He had filed a formal refusal to sign the line's safety attestation on November 11th of that year. The incident had occurred on November 22nd. 11 days. She drove up to Hartwell on a Thursday afternoon with the printouts in a leather portfolio. The leaves on the maples along Linden Street had turned to copper. Holt was washing his hands at the outdoor spigot beside the porch when she pulled up. He had just finished delivering the air compressor back to Margie's bakery. She did not bring the papers out right away. They sat on the porch in the 2 wicker chairs, and she handed him the folder. He read each page slowly, without expression, the way a man reads something he has read in his own head 1,000 times. When he was done, he handed the folder back. She asked why he had never sued. "Because of 3 little girls," he said. He looked out at the street, not at her. "If I sued, I was going to spend the next 10 years in a courtroom. I couldn't afford a lawyer worth a damn. I chose to spend the next 10 years on them instead." He paused. "And I didn't believe the court would have ruled for me. Vance had this whole town in his back pocket that year." There was a long quiet on the porch. A car passed somewhere. A dog barked once and stopped. Eleanor watched him pour coffee from a thermos into 2 ceramic mugs. His hands were not the hands of a man who held 14 patents. They were the hands of a man who had spent 2 decades fixing other people's machines so that 3 children would not grow up in separate foster homes. She set her mug down on the porch rail. "Is there anyone still alive from Vance in those years?" she said, "who knew, who was inside the room, and who might be willing to say so?" He thought for a while. "Marlene Hoyt," he said. "Richard's personal secretary. She took the minutes for every meeting that ever mattered. She'd be in her 60s now. She retired a few years back. Last I heard, she went home to Pittsburgh." The house was a small red brick on a quiet street in the suburb of Bethel Park, 15 minutes south of downtown Pittsburgh. The front yard was neat, a single rocking chair on the porch, a wind chime that did not move. Eleanor knocked at 1:30 on a Wednesday afternoon. The woman who came to the door had silver hair cut short, and a cardigan buttoned to the throat. She looked at Eleanor's business card through the screen for a long 10 seconds. "I signed a non-disclosure," Marlene Hoyt said. 40 pages. I am not breaking it." She closed the door. Eleanor drove back to the Hampton Inn near the airport and lay on top of the bedspread for an hour, staring at the ceiling. Then she got back in the car and drove to the house a second time. It had started to rain by then, a thin cold rain off the river. She did not knock again. She stood at the foot of the porch steps with her hands in the pockets of her coat and waited. 40 minutes passed. The rain came harder. Her shoulders soaked through. The door opened. "Get in here before you catch pneumonia," Marlene said. The living room had a brown wingback chair, a sofa with a crocheted throw, a wall of books that were almost all novels. There were no family photographs anywhere. Marlene poured tea without asking. She did not sit down. "I kept a copy," she said finally, "of the meeting minutes from November 23rd, 2004. The morning after the incident, Richard called in the legal department and gave the order to terminate Holt Brennan and to, his exact phrase, clean up the OSHA file. I typed those minutes myself. I made a duplicate on the office copier, and I took it home in my purse. I kept it for one reason. If they ever came for me, I wanted leverage." She walked into the bedroom and came back 2 minutes later with a manila envelope sealed with red wax. She set it on the coffee table. "There's more in there than the minutes." She broke the seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first was the meeting minutes. 4 typed pages. Signature at the bottom. M. Hoyt, recording. The second was a single sheet of yellow legal paper, handwritten in blue ink, dated November 8, 2004, a resignation letter addressed to the engineering department of Vance Industries, signed Daniel J. Cole. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It described in technical detail the failure mode in the secondary pressure relief assembly on production line 7. It stated that Daniel had raised the issue twice with line management, and once with the vice president of legal, and had been ignored. It stated that he intended to resign within the week if the line was not pulled from service. The letter had never reached the engineering department. Richard Vance had intercepted it from the internal mail tray and had never allowed it into Daniel's personnel file. Eleanor held it in her hand. The paper was thin and dry. "I am 64 years old," Marlene said. "I am not doing this for money. I do not want to die with this thing in my house. Daniel had 3 little girls. I was wrong to be quiet for 20 years. Eleanor put both documents back into the envelope. She drove east through the rain. At a gas station outside Carlisle, she stood under the awning and called Margaret Cole. She said only, "I have what you need. Emergency meeting first thing tomorrow morning." That same evening in Hartwell, Holt Brennan was in his garage fixing an old top-loading washing machine that Mrs. Henley from 2 houses down had finally given up on. The radio was on low. He did not know yet that anything had moved. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Vance Industries had been booked for the closing negotiations 6 weeks in advance. Catering had set out a long table of pastries against the back wall. Nobody touched them. On the Vance side, Richard, the 7 members of the board, 4 in-house counsel. On the Cole side, Margaret, Ruth, Juniper, and Eleanor, who sat 1 seat removed from the Cole sisters with her own folio in front of her. Margaret formally tabled the non-financial clause. The single sheet went around the table hand to hand. Richard read it, set it down, and laughed once. A dry, small sound. "This is business, Miss Cole, not a morality court. You can withdraw this clause, or you can withdraw from the transaction. Either is acceptable to me." Eleanor stood up. She remained standing while she spoke. She stated, for the record, that she was formally withdrawing as counsel of record for Vance Industries, effective immediately due to a material conflict of interest that had come to her attention in the course of due diligence. She placed Marlene's envelope on the center of the table. Richard's face changed. "This is a serious breach. Whitford and Crane will answer for." The chair of the independent directors, a woman in her late 60s named Catherine Lowell, raised one hand and said, "Richard, be quiet." Catherine opened the envelope. She read the first page. She read the second. She passed the meeting minutes to the director on her left, and the handwritten letter to the director on her right. The room was silent, except for the rustle of paper. The 4 Vance attorneys looked at each other and did not speak. Margaret stood up. She read her father's name aloud, Daniel J. Cole. Then she read the resignation letter in full, paragraph by paragraph, in a voice that was even and unhurried and did not rise or fall. When she reached the final sentence, she set the letter down on the table and remained standing. Richard made one motion toward his lead counsel. 2 of the independent directors stood up at the same time. The senior of them, a former federal judge named Howard Renz, called the session suspended pending an internal investigation under Article 9 of the corporate bylaws. The acquisition was put on hold, not because Cole had withdrawn, but because Vance no longer had the legal authority to sell pending the outcome of the inquiry. The 4 in-house attorneys looked at each other in silence and made no further objection. One of them, the most junior, very quietly slid his copy of the meeting agenda into his briefcase and zipped it shut. Catherine Lowell turned to Richard. "You are asked to leave this room." Richard did not move for a long moment. Then he gathered his papers slowly and stood. He did not look at any of the 3 sisters as he walked the length of the table. Juniper had been silent through the entire meeting. She rose from her chair, walked the length of the table, and placed a small photograph face up in front of Richard. It was a snapshot. The colors faded warm. 3 little girls in matching red parkas, and a younger Holt Brennan with shorter hair, in the garage of a small house in Hartwell, the winter of 2004. Junie did not say anything. She looked at Richard for exactly 1 second, and then she turned around and walked back to her sisters. Richard looked down at the photograph. He did not pick it up. He did not put it down anywhere else. He simply stopped beside it for a half second, and then he kept walking out of the room. Eleanor stood at the end of the table with her hand still resting on the empty envelope. Margaret looked over and caught her eye. She gave the smallest possible nod. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran the story above the fold on Monday morning. Vance Industries acquisition halted amid 20-year-old whistleblower documents. The article quoted the meeting minutes verbatim. It quoted the resignation letter in full. It named Holt Brennan by his full legal name in the third paragraph. By midday, it had been picked up by the Associated Press wire and by every major business outlet on the East Coast. The Hartwell Register reprinted its own December 4, 2004 article on its front page the same day, this time with a one-paragraph editor's note offering a formal apology for not pursuing the story when it had been new. The editor, a man named Owen Pratt who had been a junior reporter in 2004, wrote the note himself. Things in Hartwell began to happen quietly. A retired electrician named Roy Tomlin walked up the gravel drive at 412 Linden Street on Monday afternoon, left a foil-wrapped apple pie on the porch, and tucked a folded note under the corner of the pan. The note read, in pencil, "I knew part of it. I am sorry I stayed quiet. Roy." Roy did not knock. By Tuesday there were 3 more items on the porch: a jar of peach preserves from a woman Holt did not remember by name, a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel, a handwritten card from a man who had worked the same line as Daniel and who had moved to Ohio in 2007 and had carried the unsaid thing with him every year since. Holt went out to the garage that Monday morning at the same time he always did. He drove the air compressor he had finished servicing on Saturday over to Margie's Bakery on Main. Margie was a heavy woman in her late 50s, with flour on her forearms. When Holt walked in carrying the compressor through the back door, she set down her rolling pin, walked across the kitchen, and put her arms around his shoulders. She did not say anything. He stood still and let her. A teenage girl behind the register pretended very hard not to be watching. Eleanor drove up to Hartwell that same afternoon. She parked across the street and walked up the gravel slowly. Holt was in the garage tightening the last bolt on a transmission housing for someone's tractor. He felt her before he saw her. He set the wrench down on the bench. They did not say anything for what felt like a long time. She held out an envelope. He took it. Inside was a single typed letter on Cole Holdings' letterhead, signed by Margaret Cole as chief executive. The transaction would close within 30 days, following the conclusion of the internal investigation. The non-financial clause would be honored in full. The renamed entity would be called Cole Vance Industries. The public statement of restoration would go live on the corporate website on the day of close and would name him in the second paragraph. Mr. Holt Brennan was invited, and as a guest of honor, to attend the public press conference at the company headquarters in Philadelphia. He read the letter twice. He folded it neatly into thirds and slipped it into the chest pocket of his work shirt. He looked up at her. "Do you want to stay for coffee?" She nodded. They sat on the porch in the 2 wicker chairs. The afternoon light came in low across the maple trees. Neither of them said anything for a long time, and the steam rose off both mugs in the cool air. A man across the street raised one hand from his mailbox in something that was not quite a wave and not quite anything else. Holt raised his back. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, the ground floor lobby of Vance Industries was set up as a press venue. 60 reporters, 12 broadcast cameras, a small wooden podium with the new corporate seal on a navy backdrop behind it. It was the same lobby Holt had walked out of with a cardboard box in his arms, in the rain, in November of 2004. He had driven down from Hartwell that morning in the Ford Ranger. The truck was old now, the paint dull, but it still started on the first try. He had parked it on a side street 4 blocks away because he had not wanted to pull up at the front of the building in front of cameras. He walked the 4 blocks with his hands in his coat pockets, and he stopped once on the sidewalk across the street to look at the building from the outside before he went in. Catherine Lowell opened the conference. She read aloud the conclusions of the independent investigation. Richard Vance had submitted his resignation as chief executive and as chairman. The investigation file had been forwarded to the office of the Philadelphia County District Attorney. At the formal request of the United States Department of Labor, the OSHA case file from January of 2005 was being reopened for review. The reading took 9 minutes. The room was perfectly still. Margaret stepped up to the podium. Ruth stood at her right shoulder. Juniper stood at her left. Margaret read a short prepared statement. The acquisition was complete. The renamed company would be called Cole Vance Industries. Then, she set the paper down and looked out over the room. "I would like to invite the man," she said, "who made it possible for the 3 of us to have a life at all, to come up here." Holt stood up from the front row. He was wearing a gray button-down shirt, no jacket, no tie. His hair had been combed once that morning. He walked to the podium without rushing. The room went quiet. Somewhere a camera shutter went off, and then another. And then they stopped. He had no speech in his hand. He stood at the microphone for a moment, and then he said slowly, "The day I brought 3 little girls home, I didn't know I was being a father. I just knew if I didn't take them, no one else was going to take all 3. Daniel Cole was my friend. I have never done a single thing in the last 20 years in order to be paid back for it. But if today means that Daniel Cole's name gets said the right way, then I'll take that. For him, not for me." He stepped back from the microphone. The 3 women rose from the front row at the same time. They walked up the aisle, slowly, between the rows of seated reporters, and they put their arms around him in the middle of the lobby, with every camera in the room running. Holt's hand came up and rested on Juniper's shoulder, and the camera that was closest caught the small shake in his fingers. Juniper was the only one of the 3 who was crying. Margaret had her eyes closed. Ruth had a hand flat against his back. At the back of the lobby, Eleanor Whitford stood against a marble column with her arms crossed in front of her. She was not in the photographs. She did not step forward. She watched. Hartwell in early November had the kind of light that came in low under a flat gray sky. Maple leaves had turned the color of beaten copper and lay all the way down the gravel drive at 412 Linden Street. The air was cold, but the rain had not come yet. Holt was on the porch when the black sedan pulled up. He had pried up the rotted last step that morning, cut a new piece of cedar to length on the sawhorses in the yard, and was driving the final nails in with the flat side of a framing hammer. The new wood was pale against the weathered gray of the others. Eleanor got out of the car. She was not wearing a suit. A gray wool sweater, jeans, low boots, 2 paper cups of coffee from Margie's bakery balanced in one hand. She walked up the drive without hurrying. She sat down on the new step. He had just finished it. She handed him one of the cups. They drank the coffee in silence for a while. A pickup truck went past at the end of the street. Somewhere a screen door closed. "I left Whitford and Crane last week," she said after some time. "I rented a small office on Walnut Street. I'm taking labor cases. People who can't afford the big firms." He waited. "I'd like to call it Brennan Legal Aid," she said, "if that's all right with you." He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded once. He did not say anything. His phone buzzed in his shirt pocket. He took it out. Maggie was calling on FaceTime 3-way with her sisters. Maggie was in a car somewhere in downtown Chicago, in the back of a town car, looking out the window at a gray skyline. She was opening a branch office there next month. Ruth waved from a kitchen Eleanor did not recognize, and held up a set of house keys with a paper tag on them, and said she had just signed the paperwork on a place in Hartwell, 2 blocks from his. Juniper was driving north on I-95 with her phone propped on the dashboard, laughing, and said she was on her way for Sunday dinner and was bringing a pie from Margie's. The call ended. Holt slipped the phone back into his shirt pocket. He had not said much during the call. He rarely did during those calls. He listened, he asked 1 or 2 practical questions, and he made sure each of the 3 of them was eating. That had been the shape of every Sunday for the past 15 years, and it had never once needed to be different. The porch was quiet again. There was only the sound of the wind moving the dry maple leaves at the edge of the lawn, and somewhere a long way off, the steady small sound of a dog barking and then stopping. Holt did not look at her when he spoke. 20 years ago, he said, "I walked out of that building with a cardboard box. I never thought there would come a day when somebody would sit out here with me on an afternoon like this one." Eleanor did not answer. She tilted her head and looked down the long line of the yellow maples at the end of the street. Her hand rested on the new wood of the step. His hand was on the same step, about a hand's width away from hers. Neither of them moved their hand. The coffee in both cups had gone almost cold. Neither of them had said the word. Neither of them needed to.